You think the 1960s were just TV dinners and convenience foods? Think again. Thrifty home cooks stretched every penny into meals so satisfying that expensive ingredients couldn't compete, all without a single cookbook in sight. Let's dig into 60 cheap 1960s recipes you'll wish you knew years ago. Navy bean loaves are pretty much exactly what you think they are. Want the comfort of a baked loaf along with all the benefits and muscle building of 3 different kinds of beans? You've found the right recipe. This loaf was a budget-friendly, meatless meal that became popular among the working class and people who were trying to cut down on how much meat they were eating. Growing health concerns really made people turn to dishes like this more and more often because they were realizing that they couldn't afford, financially, physically, or mentally, several health scares per year just because of higher cholesterol or something. Bean loaves were something that were synonymous with being a clean, healthy dish. They were also very filling, and they would go around a family of 4 pretty easily. Beans were a great source of fiber, not just protein, so they also made you full for longer. You could literally just mash and blend them into a thick paste. You could also leave a few chunks in there for a better bite, and then you would just need breadcrumbs and crackers to bind everything together. Pour in some eggs for a better shape, and throw it in the oven. American-type goulash became a comfort food that was known for so many things that made your life easy. Simplicity, typically, was what people wanted during this time. Think about it. Work culture has only gotten worse in our generation. You come home clocking that 9-to-5 shift? What's the first thing that goes in your head? Maybe hop in the kitchen, thaw some chicken, and dirty your hands with some spices and grease? Come on, dude, no. You want to catch up on some Z's. Take a power nap. Get some of your pep back, you know? American goulash was such a good dish exactly because it let you do all of these things while still having a full stomach. In some places, you'd call it chop suey, but really, depending on the region you were in, you would see something entirely different. Some people had the whole thing consisting of this rich tomato sauce with diced and boiled tomatoes to go with it. Others really thought you couldn't make it work without a big focus on ground beef. This was the most popular option since, out of everything, ground beef being the center of the dish made it both affordable and familiar. Then, some people also really liked elbow macaroni. It was a pretty common sight to see in American goulash. The dish tasted very homely, and you could feed a family of 5 or more with one batch.
Here's a trend that was really popular throughout the 1960s that we haven't talked much about. Guess again, carrots were a part of the entire movement surrounding glazed vegetables. I'll put it plainly, vegetables do not make for an exciting meal. I'm sorry, I know that sounds like it's a hill someone with the taste buds of a 12-year-old would die on, but it's just not the most exciting thing to order. That was mostly because a lot of vegetable recipes didn't go beyond ever baking them or using them as a side though. Once people found new ways to incorporate vegetables into their diet, like glazing them, they realized how good they could be. Particularly turnips were really helpful in shattering this image. Glazed turnips were one of the most common Depression-era meals. Now the next thing, why the name Guess Again? It's because despite how you associate carrots with a slightly earthy and planty taste, this first bite is actually the opposite. It's really sweet, and it's packed with an amount of flavor you'd never associate with a carrot. It got really popular, not just as a side, but as a standalone veggie dish as well.
Cobb salad, on the other hand, was America's attempt at finally trying to eat healthy while being on a budget. Lettuce, eggs, tomatoes, and cheese were things that were so widely available that it was a wonder if someone even had to go out shopping for this list of ingredients. People were also trying their hardest to cut down on their meat consumption, but that just wasn't happening as ideally as vegetarians and health nuts had hoped for. Nobody could escape the call of bacon, and Cobb salad wasn't an exception. Still, it's not like people had no impulse control. They would throw in chicken and turkey in there for the sake of having some good protein. It wasn't something you would just make at your home. You could even go to steakhouses and local diners for this. It was a dish that was perfect for casual dining. Also, by the 60s, lots of people were returning to the workforce, and for the first time, that also included droves of women. Stretching $1 in the 1960s often meant creating illusions. and mock ham loaf was a culinary sleight of hand. Ham, or anything resembling it, wasn't something most struggling families could afford, but resourceful cooks found a way to mimic its flavor and appearance without breaking the bank. The secret was a mix of ground pork, ground beef, breadcrumbs, and a touch of brown sugar, all baked into a loaf that looked, and maybe even tasted, a bit like ham. For a dash of authenticity, a hint of clove or mustard might be added. It wasn't exactly Sunday dinner at Grandma's, but it fooled enough taste buds to pass as a treat. The ingredients of mock ham loaf were simple and accessible, often leftovers or inexpensive cuts of meat that could be stretched into multiple meals. Nutritionally, it provided a solid dose of protein and calories, though the high fat and sugar content might have been best balanced with a side of something green, if you could afford it. It brings back memories of ingenuity in the face of adversity and a time when flavor was less about authenticity and more about making the best with what you had. Mock ham loaf wasn't ham, but it certainly wasn't a bad stand-in. Homemade fish sticks were a really easy dish to make at home. They were really popular in blue-collar households and rural farmsteads that either couldn't afford the back and forth to big cities to get hauls of frozen food, or just ones who preferred to make their own stuff. Even if the transport wasn't an issue, frozen food would outright just be more expensive than people could accept sometimes, especially things like Gorton's or Van de Kamp's. Families didn't really just write the idea off entirely, though, because the concept of fish sticks being frozen for later use is pretty good. They adapted it into a homemade recipe instead, and this was especially true for all the towns near coastal areas like in the Great Lakes. They had access to all kinds of fresh local fish. But what about the people who had lived their whole lives in landlocked areas with no sight of water? Well, they used canned or frozen fish, and they used it more sparingly than others, but they would still resort to making their own fish sticks at home. Buying entire fillets and cutting them up was a lot more cost-effective than buying the prepackaged thing. Also, if you were a Catholic and meatless Fridays were really a thing back in your home, this was a great alternative. Slumgullion stew is an American dish that became known for how easy it was to prepare. I mean, seriously, you think of stews, and your mind immediately goes to all the hard work and blood and sweat that goes into making a proper one, especially if you're cooking for a decently sized group. Some of these stews could get real costly too, but not slumgullion, no. This dish was a comfort food recipe that had been twisted, diluted, and transformed in so many ways across the decades, but still always managed to retain what made it work. That's very rare for most recipes, as they often lose their original essence in translation from one era to another. A slumgullion stew typically looks like lots of beef, macaroni, greens like canned tomatoes, corn, and beans. And they would also throw in chili beans and vegetable soups to add to the broth. By the 1960s, suburban living had become the norm, and a family diner was what most people were buying their groceries for. Slumgullion stew was a mouthful to eat and say, so it worked really well.
Sheet pan paprika chicken and veggies were a pretty explosive dish that got popular for a number of things. Everyone likes a team player, don't they? Something that suits a lot of people. This was exactly one of those things. You have here a dish that's easy to make since it uses basic vegetables, is a one-pan meal, and uses boneless breasts. Then you have something that basically has no skill ceiling. You don't need to be a pretty good cook or a sauté master to really make this work. Know how to roast? You're good to go. Then you need some basic seasonings like paprika, and everyone knows their way around potatoes and carrots. Altogether, you end up having a wonderfully simple dish that takes paprika and reminds people why it's such a top dog in the spice world. It's something that blends European influences alongside typical American seasonings and makes them work extremely well, and people honestly love it for that. This kind of meal worked really well with the way job culture was changing in America. People were finding themselves working longer shifts and more hours than ever before. One-pan meals where most ingredients were made well in one pan got really popular. Little meal prep, and you could often just make them in advance too. So one of the most memorable things to come out of the Great Depression and wartime cooking was the extreme focus on all kinds of stews. People were realizing more than ever before that a stew is the best way to have food for a few days and keep a family well fed.
Beef bourguignon in the 1960s in America was something that was a lot more affordable than you would originally think. See, the way beef developed, it was becoming too popular and common for the government to not do something about the price. It settled around 50 to 80 cents a pound, making it a pretty cost-effective dish for what it was worth. The rest, you just needed a couple of dollars for, vegetables and table wine included. French influences like Julia Child and her book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, a 1961 classic, made beef bourguignon something that home cooks could finally begin trying in real life. See, while beef was getting more affordable, it wasn't exactly something people could ever experiment with. If your idea went wrong, you just wasted some beef. Or worse, you wasted a pound of it. The vegetables and wine were really replicable, but a lot of people couldn't stand wasting beef, especially since not everyone lived near butcher shops. Anyway, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about some areas where this dish thrived. So, whether it's Connecticut or Detroit, Chicago, or New York, you'll find lots of places in history cashing in on the trend of beef bourguignon. This, after all, was where it made its name. Even in places like Minneapolis and Massachusetts, French influence had people by a chokehold. The savoriness and tanginess from the red wine reduction was something that drew more and more customers to restaurants every day. The tightly sealed in and dense flavor from the extensive braising made this a standout dish, one to remember, and definitely one to tell your friends about. Classic of frugal cooking, beans and cornbread were a lifeline for families stretching their grocery budgets. Simple, hearty, and satisfying, this duo was a staple in homes where creativity met necessity. Dried beans were a pantry hero, cheap and available in bulk. Once soaked and simmered, they turned into a protein-packed powerhouse that could feed a family for pennies. Cornbread, made from affordable cornmeal, water, and a little fat, was the perfect partner, soaking up the juices from the beans while adding a touch of sweetness to balance the earthy flavors. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Nutritionally, beans brought fiber, protein, and a host of vitamins to the table, while cornbread provided energy from carbohydrates. Sure, it wasn't a feast, but it was a balanced meal that kept people going. And in some regions, a splash of hot sauce or a handful of chopped onions elevated the dish, showing how even the simplest meals could have a personal twist. Beans and cornbread is a dish that represents community and culture, particularly in the South. It's a meal tied to history, resilience, and family, proving that comfort food doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to be made with care. Hot dog and potato casseroles were literally the best thing you could get for yourself in the 1960s. If you wanted to be full, feed your entire family, make it somewhat healthy and decently tasty, and ensure it was something that the kids would eat too. That might be a pretty tall order, especially on a budget. But if you were having hot dog and potato casseroles, this is exactly the kind of experience you were getting. It was such a comfortable dish, the kind that really puts you to sleep afterwards and leaves you not wanting to get out of bed at all. Hot dogs were always a favorite among every age range, and the energy from the potato casserole plus the protein from the bits and pieces scattered and baked into the casserole made this dish stand out. While being absolutely delicious, affordable, and easy to make, hot dog and potato casseroles were also amazing for you. It was a part of the entire casserole craze that ended up consuming the 1960s. But how can you blame them? What really beats a good casserole? Corned beef hash was a real silver lining for most people to look forward to. While corned beef itself came out of Ireland, it got to the US by the 19th century. But by the middle of the 20th, it was obvious that this Irish invention had made a very American home for itself. Lots of big-name corporations also helped spread the hype around, typically Hormel's. They were the most affordable ones to get, and they were also the best quality for a few reasons. That shelf life was really nothing to scoff at, and it was a pretty hefty serving of beef in a very transportable can. Corned beef has such a rich history throughout the 20th century. In the 1960s, it was a fast way to get mashed potatoes, vegetables, and a protein on your plate and chow down. Just 20 to 30 years before that, it was actually one of the biggest things you needed to make sure you had because it was a big part of most people's very frugal daily diet.
Speaking of massive meals, chicken and wild rice casserole is a pretty good example. This is something that you'd typically see all over North America if you ever went, particularly in areas with a large Native American presence. It's because wild rice is such a big piece of their culture. It's known as manuman in Ojibwe, and it's pretty well known around the Great Lakes. Fun fact, they used to harvest wild rice by hand. Eventually, European settlers made it a mainstream part of people's diets, but that was in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were lots of reasons to be eating wild rice. It was nutritious, it was filling and affordable, and it worked really well with casseroles thanks to its inherently nutty notes. You have to understand one thing about the 60s and 50s as well. They were the first decades Americans had since the start of 1910 and the beginning and middle points of the 1920s. After that, it was just recession this, war that. People got really tired, and half the country was rediscovering their culinary spark, while the other half had sworn to pig out for the foreseeable future. And honestly, who could blame them?
Speaking of influences from different countries, let's talk about coq au vin. This French dish that's pretty much just chicken, wine, and every root vegetable you could consider fine is actually inexpensive despite hailing from the land of the French. See, whole chickens hadn't gone through the apocalyptic plague we know as post-COVID inflation. Back then, you actually could afford to get a chicken off of your minimum wage, part-time salary. Isn't that insane? Still, I came here to show you different sides of our culinary history, not reminisce about happier times. Speaking of history, the West and East Coasts had different interpretations of this dish. In San Francisco and California in specific, there was a bustling community of French immigrants that had pretty much settled down wonderfully there. Thanks to that, coq au vin was something that spread like wildfire both among the locals and the French restaurants. There was a demand for it like never before. When slow cookers eventually came around and it made cooking this dish 10 times easier, that demand only skyrocketed. Plus, table wine was really cheap. It was just $1 or $3. Can you imagine that? These are prices from just 60 years ago, by the way. It really puts things into perspective, or puts me awfully close to cheap table wine myself. Peanut butter and banana roll-ups are way better than you might think. Despite the seemingly bad impression they make in your head, these are the perfect harmony of savory peanut butter and sweet, sweet banana. Also, it works both ways. If you don't like the texture of bananas because they're very mushy, then you'll enjoy this because more peanut butter actually makes it resemble a custard. If you're already a fan, then you'll find that the sweet richness only makes this much better. So most of the time in the 60s, people used to use flattened tortilla bread for this. Now, some people like to toast theirs, but that kind of goes against the vibe of the dessert in my opinion. How do you feel about it? Also, people were very often using this as a breakfast. It worked too. As far as breakfasts go, this is easily the most ideal one because it gives you enough energy to last through an entire day. Some people preferred to have this in smoothie form though, but that wasn't nearly as effective as making a sandwich. Think about it. What do you get with maybe 2 sandwiches using the same amount you did for the milkshake? Exactly. And you get milk on the side? Who's ever complained about that? Besides, weird people that don't like milk. Speaking of Southern cuisine creeping into other corners of the country, pimento cheese sandwiches are the quintessential Southie dish to talk about. As far as sandwiches go, they've pretty much nailed the formula. You have a taste you won't really forget thanks to the wonderful usage of pimento cheese, which is really just cheddar cheese mixed with small red peppers known as pimentos. Then, you have the sauces and vegetables. People like to keep it pretty simple, nothing too fancy. They'd throw in some red onions, or normal ones, and cloves of garlic. Some cayenne pepper and jalapenos would make it even spicier, but some people really preferred their cheese sandwiches that way. I know that at least more than a few people really enjoyed doing it this way, up in the South. As far as sauces went, most people stuck to Worcestershire sauce for how it would really add some depth to the dish. The pimento cheese sandwich was one of the best things to come out of the South because it was such an affordable and delicious meal to make. Pimento cheese wasn't really the hardest thing to get. If you lived near any kind of grocery store, then there was a pretty good chance they had it. Most people in the South also either grew their own peppers or had dedicated shops and spots for where they'd go. Everyone had their own favorites when it came to where they'd like to get their vegetables, so depending on the harvest, you'd also get some pretty different tastes.
Lexo vegetable stew is right out of the streets of Hungary and is honestly one of the best takes on a vegetable soup I've ever seen. You have the whole crew here: tomatoes, onions, paprika, sweet peppers, celery, and just about every other kind of vegetable you can imagine. I think we'd genuinely be superhuman if we ate this every day. It has a lot of similarities to dishes like shakshuka and Balkan stews, but the American adaptation is just a tad bit different, although surprisingly not too much. The biggest change that Americans made to the dish was honestly just using sausages, bacon, and other kinds of bits of meat to make it a bit more familiar. That and really thoroughly whisked eggs, although some die-hard Hungarians found it offensive. You would typically saute onions in lard and add the peppers and tomatoes, which were coated with paprika, into the soup. Then you just let it simmer until all of that wonderful stuff came together. While this obviously works wonderfully in the winters, it's also a great dish for the summers, where a lot of these vegetables end up being in season.
So pickled herring was affordable, and it cost pretty much just chump change for most people. It was one of the cheapest sources of protein, but here's where it really shined. The thing about pickled herring was that it was widely available in just about every area of America, thanks to the fact that it was always sold in jars and cans. I mean, you could take it fresh if you wanted to pickle at home, but that would just be getting yourself into a Sorry, I'll stop. Really, I know you guys have had to put up with more than a few bad puns lately. What you wouldn't have to put up with in the 60s was a bad snack option, because if you had any sense, pickled herring was a must-have in your pantry. Homes in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and more states that were touched by Scandinavian and German culture, thanks either to the slowly developing effects of globalization or thanks to the immigrant populations present in the areas, would always make sure to have some herring lying around. In the world of affordable comfort food, few combinations have stood the test of time quite like pinto beans and rice. It was a meal that could be made in large batches, stretched over multiple days, and was accessible to almost anyone, especially in the 1960s. Pinto beans were cheap, easy to store, and packed with nutrients, while rice was a pantry staple that paired perfectly with beans, creating a filling meal. This dish was about stretching what you had and using creativity to turn simple ingredients into a hearty meal. Whether it was flavored with onions, garlic, or a dash of hot sauce, pinto beans and rice could take on many variations. Families often used whatever leftover meat they had on hand to add extra flavor. Nutritionally, beans were a powerhouse, rich in protein, fiber, and essential vitamins like folate and iron. Rice added energy through carbohydrates, making this dish a well-rounded meal that provided both sustenance and satisfaction. For many, pinto beans and rice are a cultural touchstone. It's found in households across the country, from southern kitchens to southwestern tables. This dish speaks to resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to make something great from the simplest ingredients. Cornish pasty was a portable meal that was an essential food for one specific group of people: miners. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Montana, and other popular mining regions in the United States, this was the meal to have every day. It came from Cornwall, England, and it was this handheld meat and potato pie that became so beloved by coal, copper, and iron ore miners. These miners would always be working in dirty, dark, damp, and dangerous caverns, and they had no way to really ever wash their hands in the middle of work. It's not like people were going to be investing in or carrying bottles of sanitizer. The pasties, though, weren't going to be a problem in this regard. You could hold them up by the crust and just eat the filling. Of course, this meant that miners would have to throw away the crust, but you were still eating the majority of the meal. This was also durable, and it could stay warm for hours and hours, which made it ideal for miners. Despite what you might think, some of those mines really get low temperature-wise. It was also something that Cornish miners brought into the country when they eventually immigrated. They had settled in American mining towns in the 1800s, and these pasties have been a tradition in America as well ever since. The macaroni mass movement has also spread to other dishes and facets of American culture, like our dear old chili. Chili with pasta is something you'd see all over the 20th century, but the chili macaroni fusion had not happened properly until the middle of the 20th century. It was actually thanks to all the economic struggle that was going on at the time that people decided to work with a dish that could be adapted with macaroni like this. Since macaroni itself was extremely filling but not too strong in the taste department, and since chili had nothing to offer you but flavor and wasn't really that filling, the mix was obvious. Both the dishes had a mutually beneficial relationship to gain from working with each other, and Americans are nothing if not people who have a keen nose for opportunity, especially with food. Thanks to that, the Chili Mac combo became a massive hit throughout working-class homes across the United States. This was seen as a wonderful one-dish meal that could tend to almost every need you had while still being superbly easy to make.
So the 60s wasn't just marked by us being nosy about other people and their long-standing food traditions. It was a time of culinary experimentation, if the gelatin salads didn't already make that clear for you. One of these Frankenstein-esque experiments was the zucchini hamburger pie, which, yes, I know, that's a hard one to imagine. This pie is a quintessential mid-20th century banger, and it blends in the practicality of ingredients that typically make up a lot of grocery lists, like ground beef, and the variety that zucchini offers. The thing about zucchini is that it can work in a lot of different ways, which makes it really convenient. Funnily enough, that quality is exactly why it became as popular as it did during and right after the Second World War. This summer squash was suddenly one of the most cultivated crops around the nation, and its mild flavor made it a popular pick at most farmers' markets. It had its biggest market in the suburbs of the 60s, where lots of home cooks, moms, and grandmas relied on zucchini harvests for their show-stopping dishes. This combination of beef and zucchini in the form of a pie was definitely one of those main players in their roster. And it's a dish that, despite losing its relevance over the years, really made waves for how it explored some new ground in both the way you use a hamburger patty and what you can do with pie.
I'm about to tell you something you never saw coming. See, the funny thing about crab cakes and crab in general is that it actually used to be dirt cheap. Yes, I know the first thing in your head was that how could something like crab meat make its way onto a list for food that would give away the fact your bank is hurting a little? Crab is something people save up for when they want a special occasion, or they have someone special to spend on. It's not something you look at as a snack, meal, or just a casual lunch to go out for, and I think that's the narrative most of us have grown up with. Crab cakes would use mixes of fresh crab, breadcrumbs, and eggs, which would make it a really simple dish all around. The cheapness of crabs couldn't be underestimated, as they were actually around just 35 to 60 cents live weight back then. This was something that came with a catch, though, which I think some of you may have seen coming. See, fresh crab meat would go for that cost, but that was only in coastal areas where crabs were abundant. A reason for the increase in price hikes for crabs is because overfishing also damages their numbers throughout the years, and that overfishing started and sowed its seeds in times like these. Outside of these fishing-reliant areas, fresh crab was still a luxury, one that could easily put you short of a couple of dollars. Crab cakes were something that seafood restaurants and places relied on thoroughly, but it was the Mid-Atlantic where crab cake culture really shined, both with low-key casual and affordable variants and upscale luxurious crab cake-based dishes. Creamed corn and bacon on toast was one of the best meals to ever make for yourself. I know we've had a fair amount of toast-based dishes, but there really were so many things you could do. The format is timeless. Now, spreading bacon bits on toast isn't exactly anything we would call revolutionary, but the idea of adding creamed corn onto it as well? Now we're talking. Corn has always had an extremely warm place in most people's hearts because it's just a crop that's always there for you. It's really easy to grow, and almost every farming household or town would have an ample supply of corn. They'd dedicate a chunk of their land to it if they could, because it wasn't just good, nutritious, and free food, it was also good for trading. But you can't do any of that without a good breakfast, and that's also where corn is a great friend to have. Creamed corn with bacon on toast was also something people made sandwiches out of by adding olives, jalapenos, and other toppings to it to make it more exciting and filling. Usually, kids wouldn't really settle for just creamed corn on toast, so it was a lot easier to make a sandwich out of it for them. Go to the Midwest, Rome, Detroit, and Chicago, and for a few blocks or neighborhoods you'll find lots of Chinese food, but out of all that, what will really stick in your head is egg drop soup. The cultural movement of Chinatown's Chinese food and a general dip into Asian cuisine was something that was primarily contained on both the East and West coasts, but it was also popular in the Midwest. Now, if you actually did live on the coasts during all of this, then you definitely know what I'm talking about. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, every major urban hub had a pretty large population of Chinese Americans, and egg drop soup was a pretty key item on the menu. These cities were really nice centers for people to try out Chinese food, especially because you could get the authentic stuff from immigrants who were working in restaurants. It was a big way of introducing the American population to more cuisines outside of their own, and I dare say they liked it enough to make it a mainstay. Plus, even if you go to the East Coast or the Northeast in places like New York or Boston, the trend of American food mixing with Chinese techniques and recipes was rising so much that it was hard to believe these were the same people who didn't know a thing beyond chow mein just a few years ago.
So we've never really delved into a lot of Russian cooking. Granted, there's not a lot to speak of, at least not in comparison to other regions. Still, one dish that's really worth talking about is ukham, Russian fish soup. This really changes region to region because the kind of fish that you can get for your catches of the day makes a different soup each time. Typically, though, most traditional recipes call for a lot of perch, carp, and cod. These recipes all have one thing in common. They fillet the fish and cook it on the bone. Ukha is typically made in a clear broth alongside those fish, and the heads, tails, and bones really help to add flavor. The next layer in its profile comes from all the aromatics. You have carrots, onions, and parsley roots, as well as just a little bit of black peppercorns and dill. So far, we have a lot of ingredients that might be a little unfamiliar to you, but this one takes the cake. Have you ever heard of vodka with your soup? Me neither, but leave it to the Russians and the French to find a way to mix every kind of alcohol into food.
Chicken cordon bleu is another funny one. It's something that is strictly middle class, but you can just tell this dish is trying to be something more. The fascination that the American population had with French and European cuisine and culture in the middle of the 60s was definitely interesting. It was a fascination that went into our cookbooks, our magazines, our media and movies, our dinners and our parties, and our restaurants. So you have to think, how did it really get this far? Well, again, it's kind of what I said before. Americans got tired of the typical, the regular, the mundane. They didn't want the same Monday to Friday menu they were used to, both at their regular joints and at home. They wanted fresh new flavors. Why do you think out of all the things that got popular and ended up being nation-swooping trends, fusion food and hybrid experimentations were the ones that took the cake? It's because more than anything, after a first half of the century that put them through the ringer and a diet that hadn't changed in over a century, people just wanted something new. Chicken cordon bleu was a fresh and interesting new way of having chicken breasts. It was cheap, affordable, and it came in frozen packets, which made it all the more convenient. And don't let anyone ever tell you we didn't get inspired by the French either. Creamed peas on toast were a very simple and inexpensive meal that helped many people get through the day in the 1960s, especially throughout rural America. Peas were man's best friend because of how abundant they were. You could also throw them on top of anything for a better crunch and flavor, or you could just make breakfast meals out of them like this. The 1960s were seen as a transitional period for the culinary world in America. Processed convenience foods were slowly starting to dominate, but working-class homes were going to feel the change later than others. They were still relying on home-cooked meals that had been passed down from family to family. That's pretty much how it would work in a lot of rural areas. People would find out a great idea, record it, pass it down to their kids. Sometimes that would be ways to farm or maintain the home, and other times it would be how to have a breakfast that saves you money. A can of peas cost just a few cents, And it did the job better than anything else if you didn't have beans on hand, so why not? I mean, it's a lot better than just toast. Speaking of casseroles, you might actually be surprised by all the different kinds you may find during this era. See, thanks to the Depression, people had really opened their ideas of what a casserole could be far more than ever before. As a result, you had things like macaroni and tomato casserole popping up, and this was a pretty good dish for several reasons too. Firstly, macaroni wasn't expensive at all, and neither was ground beef. It was a really convenient family recipe that you could hold for Sunday dinner or even play around with to switch things up. Maybe you used sausages instead of ground beef. Maybe this time, you put in bell peppers, or topped it with breadcrumbs, or really went crazy with the cheese. All these little things made this one-dish meal a world of fun for home chefs who were still looking for an easy-to-handle dish that let them try out different ideas. People really did like their cheese, though, and they didn't hold back on the ground beef for this. As far as the public reception went, there was definitely a crowd of people who thought they wanted to keep tomatoes and macaronis out of their casseroles and only in their pastas, but for the most part, people loved it.
While exploring the many flavors and styles of the subcontinent has been a recent development, the seeds for it were being sown with recipes like chicken and collards pilau. This Southeast Asian dish was adapted in the southern parts of America, and while it was distinctly different from its authentic version in places like India, it was still a good attempt. Pilau itself is something that isn't entirely exclusive to Southeast Asia, though it also has African influences. Both styles of this dish were used across the states, with the South typically leaning more towards the version brought by the African diaspora. The cooking techniques here really involved a lot of slow cooking. The rice was supposed to be set to oil alongside the broth, which was loaded with vegetables and chicken. You had your onions, garlic, paprika, and bell peppers, which was a bit of a deviation from the typical recipe, but Americans need to adapt things for their own palates. Some people called it soul food, some people thought it was Indian cuisine breaking into America, but a lot of people tried it, enough that it stayed as a part of many menus even today, and that's how you know you have a good dish on your hands.
Keep it moving. Now, you've heard me repeat how lamb and beef were a lot more expensive than pork, and that's doubly true for lamb chops. These actually are the first item here we have, besides maybe a very flashy version of baked ziti, that crosses $1, totaling for around $1.29. These chops were not the same price as your knockout cuts of steak that would get all the rich folks spreading their wallets and purses, but it would still get a lot of traction. See, in the 60s, American culture was in a cocoon-like phase. It was changing, crumbling, adapting, and being inspired by all the different communities that existed in the country. By all accounts, it had become a melting pot. A pot where flavors and ideas of the entire world came together to stew, simmer, and eventually become something wildly different. How does this tie back into lamb chops? Depending on the area you were in or the community, you could have pork chops that were done in the style of Greek cuisine or Scandinavian cuisine, or even Eastern European takes on lambs. Some people would season it with garlic, whereas others would go for things like rosemary or mint. People would broil their chops, pan-sear them, and even grill and roast them. Like I said, it was a melting pot, and you had at least 10 different ways of trying lamb chops before you could say you had seen it all. In times when budgets were tight and the pantry looked bare, creativity in the kitchen was essential if you wanted to survive. Enter slumgullion, a dish with a name as quirky as its ingredients. This one-pot wonder was less of a recipe and more of a philosophy. Take whatever you have, throw it in a pot, and hope for the best. Typically made with ground beef, onions, potatoes, pasta, and canned tomatoes, slumgullion was affordable and easily customizable. Couldn't afford beef? Swap it out for hot dogs or skip the meat altogether? Low on vegetables? A can of peas or a handful of frozen corn would do the trick. It was the epitome of accessibility. Everything came straight from the pantry or fridge, no fancy ingredients required. Nutritionally, it offered just enough to keep everyone going. The mix of carbs from potatoes and pasta, protein from meat, and a splash of vitamins from canned veggies made it a practical, filling meal. Sure, It wasn't gourmet, but it filled plates, and that's what mattered. It's a dish that captures the spirit of resilience, turning scraps into sustenance and proving that even in hard times, mealtime could bring people together. Simple, humble, and undeniably resourceful. Carrot and raisin salad sandwiches were the prime example of how to make something healthy not taste like death. They were the best thing to have whenever you would visit the countryside, and even people in urban areas started to adopt this recipe. That's because when you see a genuinely good deal, you just don't let it go. And there's rarely a deal as good as this one. Raisins were shelf-stable, sweet, naturally full of sugar, and they could last for weeks if kept properly. Just a bit of Miracle Whip would do wonders for the dish, too. Carrots, on the other hand, were extremely cheap, reasonable to buy in bulk, and for most people in the countryside, a standard crop that they were already growing. They only required some grating and mixing, and it basically was the perfect summer dish because of how refreshing it was. I'm sure the experience of melting in the summer and being forced to deal with the fact that you're an adult human is one we all dread. In times like that, and since it's summer, it's always like that, you want to really spend as little time in the kitchen as possible. A dish like this works even better because you have to spend all of 15 minutes to get it done, and in return, you get a whole haul of goodies. Vitamin A, natural sugar content, fiber, and my mom used to tell me carrots helped improve your memory. So if you're looking to try a new kind of salad, this 60s sensation is probably for you. Hobo stew is a funny one. It gets its name from the lifestyle that people were living in the Great Depression. That was a decade marked by people drifting in and out of the edge of poverty and the very rock bottom of it. Most people were working in unmaintained environments or cooking right over open fires. The stew got its name from how rustic it was and how it typically was made in places like this during this time, but it's actually named that out of endearment. People thought this stew was a sign of how they really didn't want to be done in by the Depression and how they were just struggling to get by only one more day. It was a one-pot meal that you really improvised and used a lot of hands-on ingredients instead of a dedicated shopping list, but somehow, that's exactly what the 1960s wanted. Lots of Depression and war-era dishes still stuck around, or at least their concepts did, because of how they were so adaptable to a fast-paced environment. If you ever had the time to spend doing lots of prep work and just needed to get to work as soon as possible, this is the kind of stuff you could go for.
There was another trend that was pretty much unique to the middle of the 20th century, which was a turning point for a lot of things. Chicken salad pie was one of the examples of how America was really trying to take its commitment to healthy eating just a bit more seriously for once. You'll notice that every time the status quo tries to change to something else in America with regard to food, it always has to start off with something familiar. Like, for example, chicken salad pie does involve a salad, but it gives it to you in the form of a pie, which is infinitely familiar. Pineapples have to be served on pizza and with ham for them to be noticed. And even then, the discourse on whether or not it's food blasphemy never stops. This chilled salad was just as divisive, with a lot of people thinking that salads have no place in pies. Chicken salads have been around as early as the 20th century, though, and it doesn't seem like they have any intention of leaving. This pie was an everyday meal you could make and also use as an excuse to get just a few more greens into your family's diet, which is something Americans really could use a lot more of.
Baked ziti couldn't land further on the opposite side of the spectrum. So far, this is our most expensive item yet. The cheese for this bad boy would run you around 50 to 70 cents easily, and that was a price you could expect in most markets and grocery stores. The canned tomato sauce was the cheapest, since it would basically just be for $12 or $14, and the pasta itself was around $15. Naturally, in places with a heavy concentration of Italian-American populations across the suburbs and neighborhoods, this dish was a regular hit. Northeast, you had Connecticut and New York making new strides with how well Americans understood pasta. In the Midwest, traditional forms of authentic Italian dishes and recipes were being preserved by immigrants that had a knack for tradition. This rich and cheesy dish might taste just a bit different depending on where you find yourself landing, but it's something worth trying in whatever area of the United States you find yourself in. The pasta and tomato sauce were cheap, and since it was cheesy, it didn't have a lot going on. People saw it as a dish that was okay for your casual lunch or dinner, especially on a budget. Cucumber and onion sandwiches were a really simple and refreshing butter, mayonnaise, different kinds of spices, and sometimes bits of bacon and ham on top of cucumbers. See, now I don't know if you guys will agree with me, but cucumbers really have a good place in the world of sandwiches and burgers. They're one of the most light toppings you can add, they're abundant, they're good for you, that crunchy bite is immaculate, and they work well with most kinds of sauces. It's a really straightforward dish that can work with almost anything you happen to have on hand. And on a hot summer day, this was the perfect meal to eat for your work lunch. It was served as an interlude between the usual fried, oily, and greasy food most Americans were used to anyway. Onions were something that everyone always had, and this could work with fresh or stale bread. They were beloved mostly for their detoxifying effects and how refreshing a cucumber can be. Textile workers and coal miners in particular loved these because it would take the edge off. Stuffed celery sticks are one of the nicest appetizers you can actually get. Despite what you may have originally thought, there's more use for a celery stalk than you could imagine. All you need to do is get yourself accustomed and familiar to the wonderful world of fillings. I'm talking about cheese spreads, jams, chili fillings, and peanut butter. If it can hold itself inside of a celery, it can work. Besides, people wouldn't just stick to these ready-made fillings. They'd try to look for things they could make on their own too. Making your own fillings for dishes like stuffed celery sticks was really common. After all, people were finally getting back into home cooking and how much they really enjoyed it. Stuffed celery sticks are actually some of the healthiest meals to eat too, because they take advantage of a trend that started off early in the 20th century and use it to make an otherwise boring vegetable the talk of the whole table. Stuffing vegetables started somewhere between the 1920s and 1930s as a way to make a dish heavier so that you would go longer between meals. Luckily, it stuck around once people saw the crazy appeal. It's a little bit of the work, you can make stuff like baked egg cups and get 3 times the value for your money you otherwise would. After all, instead of those curries, stews, and pizzas, this just takes 3 whole ingredients. Everything you'll find on this list is built conveniently like that, and it tastes pretty good despite the minimal effort. Here you can expect a flavorful combination of eggs layered upon bacon, a combo I know you don't want to miss at the family table. How does something like that feel when you bake it with some cheese? What does the dish start to look like if you substitute one of those core 3 ingredients? That's the beauty of these dishes. They can be anything you'd like them to be. You just need to trust in your vision. Plus, every doctor tells you over and over that you need more eggs in your diet, and it's like, okay, I get it, but that doesn't make eating them any more fun. On the flip side, all the best coaches and trainers will tell you that enjoying what you eat is the most important part of keeping a diet. Personally, I'm starting to see where their rhetoric is coming from. This is definitely better than boiled eggs. Fruit gelatin salad with cream cheese was something that was one of the most popular desserts back then in the 1960s. Jell-O cheap was cheap, really cheap, and it was around 10 to 15 cents per box. The canned fruit here was also wildly inexpensive and something you could find just about anywhere in the American states, really. Now, the most common toppings for fruit gelatin salads were whipped cream, some marshmallows, or cottage cream cheese. This was something that the American suburbia most of all loved more than anyone else. Potlucks, cocktail parties, and a lot more would serve these as regularly as they could. The salad was sweet, it was fruity, it was filled with all kinds of good vitamins and health benefits, and it was something that would get your nagging parents off of your back. Now you could call them and show them that you actually were taking your gut health seriously. As far as the flavor went for this dish, it really could have been anything depending on the kind of fruits you were using. Most people would typically just use pantry staples that they always have worked with and have lying around. It made things easier that way and gave them a lot of familiar options to experiment with before they found out what kind of Jell-O worked best for them. When money was tight but protein was a must, canned mackerel became a household hero. While it may not have carried the glamour of fresh fish, it had 2 things going for it. It was cheap and it lasted forever on the pantry shelf. Mackerel patties were a way to turn an unassuming can into a meal that could stretch far and wide, feeding hungry families on a budget. These patties were a masterclass in creativity. By mixing canned mackerel with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasoning, families transformed humble ingredients into crispy, golden cakes that packed a flavorful punch. A hot skillet was all it took to create a meal that felt like more than just survival. It felt like effort and care. For some families, even a drizzle of ketchup or a dollop of mayo on top added that final touch of luxury. And surprisingly, mackerel brought solid nutritional value to the table. Loaded with omega-3 fatty acids, protein, and essential vitamins, it gave kids the strength to grow and parents the energy to keep going. Sure, the smell while cooking could fill the entire house, but hey, at least you knew dinner was on the way. For many, mackerel patties evoke memories of resilience and warmth. It's a dish that reminds us how even the simplest ingredients could turn into a meal worth remembering. Liverwurst and mustard sandwiches were another working-class lunch that was actually really good back in the 60s. Liverwurst isn't really something we hear a lot about today, but it was still a lot better than cold cuts like ham or any kind of beef back then, really. Plus, liverwurst is known for having a very smooth texture. It's kind of like ground beef, and it's also not bad for you at all. I mean, besides the really nice protein gains, it's just super convenient to cook. It doesn't need any kind of reheating, it barely needs prep work, and the sandwiches work with anything at all. The most common pairings for this was just adding a little bit of liverwurst to rye bread with mustard and chowing away. I think the people that brought this as a lunch the most were probably blue-collar workers. It was definitely one of those go-to office lunch meals people would pack and bring. You'd especially see this in the Pennsylvania, New York areas where it was pretty much guaranteed that at least one person in the office would be having this. Also, liverwurst had an awfully mushy texture to it, which made people really want to enjoy it with bread. Something about how those textures melt in your mouth together and make this harmonious bite. We're just talking about the way people decided to sometimes mess around with their casseroles, switch out the ground beef and put in sausages instead? Yeah, they had a name for that too. It was called hot dog casserole. Like almost every casserole that made its claim to fame during the 1960s, this one had a heaping serving of pasta. Actually, elbow macaroni is something you'd see a lot more often with this one, mixed in between patches of gooey cheddar cheese and diced or cut up sausages. It was actually a pretty economical dish, and that's why it got popular in areas where common ingredients weren't so readily available. Let's talk about personality, though. Do we take this over a hot dog? How do we feel about the casserolification of almost everything? I mean, before I told you this, your idea of a hot dog was probably just the typical street food dog you get in a bun. Then again, maybe this is an idea worth trying. If sausages can work in a hot pot, there's no reason they can't work in a casserole. What do you say? In what form do you think the hot dog shines through more? Escargot was definitely something I'd think twice or thrice about before I would claim that it was middle-class food. Back in the 1960s, $1 or $3 actually meant something. It wasn't petty, chump change like it is now. Escargot would fetch you a price of $3 or even $3.50 per dozen at fine restaurants, and that made it something people would really have to save up for. You could go to gourmet markets and visit them to get canned snails and attempt a homemade version of escargot, but you wouldn't have fresh snails, so at some point or the other it was going to fall short. Luckily, at least everything else wasn't something that would stress your budget out. You had garlic butter, parsley, and bread, and that meant that you could pretty much make this dish with the stuff you had on hand. The only real costly ingredient here was the protein. The snail-eating thing is something that was common back then, by the way, and yes, it was another thing we were trying out just because it was French. Despite that, they were actually a lot more tame in terms of flavor than you would expect. Lots of people even claimed it was much more similar to mushrooms than anything else, really. It was an experience that was in the reach of middle-class people, but definitely not comfortably or frequently. Guaranteed staple in the fridge, some families had to get creative with breakfast. Enter cereal with water, one of the most humble and perhaps slightly puzzling meals of the 1960s. With milk prices rising or simply unavailable, water became the substitute of choice. At first glance, it might seem like a tough sell, crunchy cereal soaked in water instead of creamy milk. But in times of financial strain, it was an affordable and accessible solution. Cereal was already a go-to breakfast option, and water was free. For many families, this was the most practical way to get something filling into their kids without straining the budget. Nutritionally, water didn't add much, but the cereals still provided carbohydrates and, in some cases, vitamins and minerals. Sure, it wasn't a gourmet start to the day, but it did the job. For families juggling multiple mouths to feed, it was a way to stretch their resources further. For those who lived through it, cereal with water holds a certain nostalgic charm. It's a reminder of how creativity could make even the most basic ingredients into something functional. The dish might have lacked flair, but it spoke to the resilience of families who made do with what they had. Spam and fried potato hash is a really nice, filling, and easy-to-make meal that actually fits perfectly well into the diet of working-class families. It's something you would most commonly see in farmsteads, military families, and overall just everywhere across the South. I think wherever the idea of canned meat was something pivotal to people's everyday diets, this was a recipe that did numbers. It was really high in protein, fat, and calories, which meant that it was pretty much the perfect thing to have every day if you were a laborer. Spam had been something that was gaining more and more of a reputation thanks to its work in the war. It became a staple military ration during World War II. And as for potato hash, well, who would ever turn down a plate of that? So for just a few cents and the inconvenience of waiting for your potatoes to boil, this was a full-on meal that would leave you feeling very full and energized. If we go back just a bit before the war and right towards the start and middle of the Depression, you'll find that chipped beef on toast was actually one of the most common things to eat, especially across working class and rural households. There were people who had their own farms and space to grow and raise their own cattle. They would often enjoy the best versions of these. Then the rest of the population would usually be working on much tougher and cheaper cuts of meat from unwanted parts of the animals, like the back or the shoulder. It meant that the quality of the meat was something you had to work around, typically by slow cooking it so you'd get some tenderness. Still, most people really just had bread to work with. The bread was also very prone to going stale, and the beef wasn't something you could use in decent or large amounts just because you were having a bad day. It was the Depression, you know? Everyone was collectively having a bad day. Chipped beef on toast was an easy way for people to spice up their bread just a little while still being able to eat a decent breakfast.
Ground pork pasta is a pretty comforting dish that got really popular in the South. You might be surprised to hear this, but this is actually another piece of Italian culture. Ground pork has always been at the forefront of Italian cooking in America. They put pork sausages in their bolognese and make several pastas out of it too. A lot of the Italian way of cooking heavily involves a focus on garlic, wine reductions, and lots of herbs so that a flavorful base can be made for the dish. Italian immigrants would, in specific, spread around their many treasured pasta-making secrets when they first came over. They aren't the only group in America to really notice how well ground beef goes with pasta, though. A lot of Asian communities note the combination for pretty much the same reason. It works really well together, and plenty of low-budget, comforting recipes have been around it. This was a big part of home cooking in the 60s, and it was a great way to make use of some canned meat. If you had any leftover beef from a casserole or meatloaf, you could repurpose that too.
Still, there's a massive difference between beef, pork, and frog legs, which despite being only 25 to 40 cents and in some areas completely free if you caught them yourselves, were very unnerving meals. I mean, I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that there is a line in the sand we all draw somewhere, and frog legs are definitely crossing it. It was popular in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, especially because of influences from Cajun cuisine and Creole cooking techniques. In the Midwest, though, they'd take a pretty extra spin on this. Personally, I think frying frog legs in beer batter is taking it a few steps too far, but whatever works for you. This was a dead giveaway that you were middle class, though. Despite how it was only served rarely in homes, even the ones that had a taste for it, Despite how it was even featured in restaurant menus, it was always something people saw as a dish you had to settle for to eat. It wasn't as common as your other meat alternatives, and it was nowhere near as popular or as varied either. During tough times, when food was scarce and the pantry was near empty, people had to get creative. One of the most surprising inventions of the era was something you wouldn't expect to see on any gourmet menu: ketchup soup. Yes, you heard that right. Ketchup, hot water, and maybe a little sugar and salt to taste. It was cheap, it was accessible, and it was a meal when nothing else was available. The affordability of this dish was its main selling point. Ketchup was a common household item, and hot water free from the tap. It was the perfect solution for anyone who needed to fill their stomach quickly, without worrying about cost. Sure, it may not have had the nutrients of a balanced meal, but it was a quick fix that offered just enough sustenance to get through the day. What makes ketchup soup even more interesting is the sheer creativity behind it. People had to use what they had, and in this case, ketchup was a versatile base for something edible. It was resourcefulness at its finest. You could even make it a little more substantial by tossing in leftover bread to soak up the liquid. Instant makeshift croutons. Canned salmon patties were also known as salmon croquettes, and they had a few different reasons for being as beloved as they were. So, first of all, everyone just loves salmon. It's a fact of life, but salmon is one of the most popular kinds of fish to ever grace the waters and tables of the United States. Now, canned salmon takes that up a notch by being incredibly affordable, having a very long shelf, and not needing any refrigeration. Besides just being one of the most easy-to-use ingredients across the board and having a justified place in almost every kind of recipe that we see today, salmon patties did eventually go out of relevancy. I think people just moved on from the idea of having salmon in the shape of a patty instead of some saucy dish that really capitalizes on that. I like the intrigue of a good fish sandwich myself, but there's just more fun to be had. Luckily, people would use the patties in different ways at least. While some people would just eat the straight up, others would make rice bowls out of them or sandwiches and burgers. It was actually a pretty decent idea for how low effort it was. In the 1960s, Beanie Weenies weren't some kind of cute wintertime trend with beanies or a Halloween candy. They were actually something you'd see in school cafeterias almost all of the time. Why? What is a Beanie Weenie? Well, despite what it sounds like, it's actually a pretty good mix of baked beans, hot dogs, and some ground beef. This meant that it was one of the most popular mixes for parents to make during times when they had to get to work, but their kid had to get to school faster. If you're one of those people who never finds enough time to make a breakfast from scratch in the morning for their little critter, I think you might still see the value in something like this. How did Beanie Weenies emerge, though? Well, between pop culture references in shows like The Simpsons and The Goldbergs, a list of stores in every area selling affordable canned versions of the ingredients, and Beanie Weenies in general sneaking into all aspects of American life, even the military, I'd say the dish has had many places to grow some really positive PR for itself.
Amish Yum Yum salad is pretty much a creamy and incredibly rich, sweet salad made entirely out of fruits. It has a lot of its influences in the culture of the Amish, specifically around some areas in Pennsylvania where the Dutch communities are very prominent. It's similar to a lot of other dishes that are made from these cuisines as well. It makes a lot of use of what's available, and the idea here is basically to be very resourceful. Naturally though, the context these recipes find themselves in means that they have to adapt to the broader palate and trends of American eating. They kind of lose their traditional essence along the way, something that most Amish people tend to not like. Amish cooking makes a lot of use of canned fruit, whipped cream, and custard, and this recipe takes all of them to make a very interesting salad. It was pretty typical to serve this gelatin salad during family dinners. And the 60s were a time for jelly-based meals anyway.
So we're going to start off small and with some lightweight hitters. Stuffed pork loin, for example, wasn't exactly what you would call super expensive. Pork back in those times averaged around 39 to 59 cents a pound, and that was the going rate in most grocery stores. Your basic pork chops were your everyday options for beef-related nutrition. Stuffed pork loin was naturally a bit more popular, especially in places like Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina. People would throw in their own spins on this, such as including cornbread, sausages, or more. You could go upstate to New York or Pennsylvania and find the same, but this time you'd find a amore European-centric version of the dish. The typical seasonings across all regions were stuff like sage, thyme, and rosemary, so it tasted very herbal. Pork was something people relied on due to it being decently cheaper than beef and also being widely accessible, but that's what made it a status symbol. If people saw you shopping for pork, then they knew you had a budget that couldn't make any room for some real beef. When meat was a luxury and vegetables came straight from the garden, the humble tomato sandwich became an everyday hero. A couple of slices of bread, a fresh tomato, and a smear of mayo were all it took to create a meal that was as simple as it was satisfying. For families with a backyard garden, tomatoes were practically free, making this dish both affordable and accessible. Bread and mayonnaise were common pantry staples, and together they turned one juicy fruit into a full-fledged meal. If you didn't have mayo, a drizzle of oil or even a sprinkle of salt could get the job done. It was creativity born of necessity, proof that sometimes the simplest combinations are the most memorable. Tomatoes brought more than just color to the table. They offered a solid dose of vitamins C and K, along with a hint of lycopene, an antioxidant. Sure, the meal leaned light on protein, but for a quick lunch or dinner during hard times, it was hard to beat. For those who grew up in the 1960s, tomato sandwiches carry a special nostalgia. They recall a time when life was slower, meals were shared outside on porches, and a sandwich could be both an act of frugality and a taste of summer's bounty. So, bar none, the best breakfast to start your day with was always cream-chipped beef on toast. It wasn't really the most visually impressive or appealing dish, but it had a certain kind of coziness to it. Maybe it's the kind of vibe you cultivate after being a household breakfast item for years. Maybe they just liked the simplicity. All you had to do was get some toast, a can of chipped beef, and you were pretty much done. Maybe they wanted to be like their brave army because this was also one of the most widespread military breakfasts. It could be the texture, or it could be that it's an easy source of protein early in the morning. But given how all of these are likely, that really tells you just how popular of a breakfast this ended up becoming. Not only that, it was one of the most economical ways to get some beef in your diet. That was just a cut of meat that was too hard to afford regularly for most working-class families.
We're going to flip-flop between American ideas and French inspirations a lot in this list, so buckle up. Next up, we have beef Burgundy over noodles. This pretty much is ripped right out of the streets of Burgundy in France, and it's an offshoot of a classic and traditional French dish known as boeuf bourguignon. This was one of those high-end dishes you could order at upscale French restaurants meant to offer luxurious dining experiences. It wasn't really something you could make at home, but the taste was pretty irresistible. People definitely wanted more of it in their week-to-week eating plans, but they couldn't exactly keep up with the crater it was leaving in their wallets either. Well, one thing led to another, and a homemade version of it known as Burgundy over noodles came together. The dish used egg noodles instead of the traditional pastas that the French would use. It kept other things the same, such as using red wine to braise the beef. This recipe was common in cookbooks by Julia Child, who was also one of the few mainstream chefs who really vouched for this dish and tried to make it this nationwide hit. I think she pretty much achieved her goal there. You can find lots of references to this dish in cookbooks from the 60s, and I'm talking about the ones targeted at families like yours and mine.
Have you ever wondered how we got to a point where mushrooms became as popular as they are? Stuffed mushrooms in particular were the apple of most people's eyes. A packet of white button mushrooms would run you about 30 cents and keep you satisfied and full for the rest of the evening. The fillings were dirt cheap and probably things you already had on hand in your pantry too. Who doesn't have some breadcrumbs, sausage, basic herbs, and garlic laying around? Plus, mushrooms were largely free for a lot of people. Curious how? During the Depression, people really picked a few survival skills up. One of those happened to be foraging in the wild for fruit and other edible things in the wilderness. People found out that mushrooms were actually one of the greatest gifts nature ever gave us, and they got hooked. Bad. Like, really bad. Mushrooms were seen as an incredibly versatile ingredient. What couldn't you do with these babies? Throw them on pizza, put them in your soup, smash them between a burger, stir-fry them, roast them, serve them at a cocktail party, or just eat them as they are, or put them in a stew. Do you see where I'm going with this? You can't, because I'm going literally everywhere you can imagine. That's how much you can do with just a simple serving of stuffed mushrooms. French versions were often a lot more buttery, while Italian versions were a lot more prone to being filled with garlic. Either way, what you could say for sure in your life was that this is a dish you really wouldn't regret waiting around for. Chipped beef on toast was a staple in post-war households and the military alike, where stretching a budget or feeding a crowd was a survival tactic. Chipped beef, a salty, dried meat product, was cheap, shelf-stable, and available almost everywhere. Pair that with white bread and a homemade cream sauce, flour, butter, milk, and a pinch of seasoning, and you had a meal that could feed an army, literally. For less than the cost of a burger today, you could serve up dinner for the whole family. Though not exactly a health food, chipped beef provided a decent amount of protein, even if it was sodium heavy. The cream sauce, while caloric, added richness to the dish, making it feel more indulgent than it actually was. It's proof that a little resourcefulness in the kitchen could turn basic ingredients into something hearty and satisfying. For many, it was a memory. Whether you were a soldier in the barracks or a kid at the dinner table, chipped beef on toast brought people together, one humble shingle at a time. Banana and mayonnaise sandwiches were apparently all the rage back then. It was really surprising how common they had become, because usually you would give something like this a bad look and keep moving on with your day, waiting for, the chance to get an actual meal. It's definitely something no one could imagine eating in today's world. This sweet and savory combination actually had die-hard fans, though. Whether it was the fact that this was a convenient sandwich you could throw together in seconds, or how filling and high-calorie it was, people loved it. I mean, being honest with you, I've seen some pretty bizarre banana combinations over the course of preparing this video, but this one definitely stuck in my memory for a little bit. But hey, who can argue with health? And as far as that was concerned, this was a jackpot. Bananas were a natural source of energy and sugar, and mayonnaise was something that really made the dish more filling. This was also particularly popular in the South, and I know you're thinking that's really out of place, and I'd be inclined to agree with you, but the South has definitely been an experimentative place with its food. You could even get this at diners for the right price. Potato pancakes are a lot more cultural than you think. They're deeply rooted in European Jewish traditions, and even in American Jewish communities, you always find this in someone's fridge. They have some pretty strong links to the cuisine, but despite that, the 20th century was a time when America really became known for being a melting pot of different cultures. Before that, you could say that each place had its own identity, each state its own little corner of Uncle Sam's backyard, but now it really is all one big pot. In the United States, they're typically something most people link together with Hanukkah, but they're also a really big comfort food outside of that too. There's some practical history and some cultural Jewish history to this. So, practically speaking, during the Depression and wartime, people almost exclusively lived off of potatoes. Potato skins, potato soup, potato pancakes. I mean, it was one of the cheapest and easiest ways to get a pancake during then. From there on, it took off so well that most people just kept making them even after the dust settled. It was a pretty endearing exchange of traditions from one community to another. And to be honest, I think I like potato pancakes more than the original. What about you? Would you ever try a starchy variant of a typical American breakfast? Or are you booking it straight to IHOP?
Surf and turf is a seafood and ground meat combination that really took the competition by storm in most coastal regions. It's not exactly a specific dish or recipe, but a style of dishes that have a massive focus on combining things like lobster and steak. Basically, if you're a meat lover of all kinds, this is the dish for you. Where did the surf and turf name come from then? This was pretty much just slang of the times. It was used to refer to bougie dining places and big events with their exotic catering needs. It was also supposed to represent the two core components of the dish. You had your seafood, the surf, and then you had your meats, the turf. Genius, I know. If you ever needed a knockout menu for a wedding or a big dinner, then you'd go for surf and turf places. So surf and turf isn't exactly its own genre of food either. It just refers to anything that puts seafood and red-white meat together. Lots of people think that the dish first came to life in North America, but a lot of people also think it was made in the West Coast. No one can really say who the first person was to do it. It was pretty common to serve this dish with comforting sides like asparagus and beans or mashed potatoes. A lot of places would use béarnaise sauces too.
Cornish game hens were a pretty forgettable moment in American history, to be honest. I mean, no wonder they are on this list after all. So, Cornish game hens were something that were a tiny bit more costly than chicken, but still relatively affordable. The minimum price for a game hen would be around 80 cents, with most places easily coming to or exceeding $1. These were also sold frozen, which was really a massive draw for people to start buying these. See, before, you had to pretty much take the entire bird home and find a way to use it unless you were okay with wasting precious meat. These individual frozen servings meant that people could pick and choose the amount of meat they actually wanted to buy. This was actually something of a fine dining moment too for places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, although it was something that went for a good price in most upscale restaurants, but still it didn't have a lot of star power. The flavors were soft and mild, and you had to really chew to get a sense for what you were having. It didn't last long beyond the 60s, and I get it. This decade is full of things to talk about, seriously. Pig snouts breaded might sound like something you dare a friend to eat, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicacy. When meat was a rare commodity, the snout was a cheap source of something meaty, chewy, and quite palatable. The snouts were washed, cooked until soft, and then breaded before being deep-fried to golden brown. The result? A crispy outside and a very tasty meat on the inside. Well, yes, the texture may have been somewhat unusual, but when you are hungry, you don't mind. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. To Dust Bowl families, pig snouts breaded were not just edibles, but a way to pay tribute to every pound of what little they had. No part was wasted, while such meals ensured that scarcity became resourcefulness. Nowadays, breaded pig snouts can be found only in some culinary forums, but they are a vivid example of how people tried to feed themselves when there were no chips, but snouts. Would I try it? To put it in perspective, if my grandma was to prepare it with a wink and a smile, I'd be willing to take a bite. Indeed, when you survive, you become brave and perhaps a little curious. But would you try it? Leave us the answer in the comments below. Scalloped corn is a strange one. It's a creamy casserole, but it takes all kinds of ingredients that you wouldn't ever see in a casserole. I'm talking about things like corn, milk, eggs, butter, and sometimes even actual scallops if you lived in nearby coastal cities throughout the Midwest. In terms of texture, it was honestly less like a casserole and more like a custard or pudding. I mean, the cheese was really the most casserole-esque part of the whole thing. By the way, when people use the word scalloped in reference to old dishes from the 60s or any other era, they mean a baked dish that typically tends to come with some kind of cream sauce. It may also have breadcrumbs, but you get the idea. Corn, I get. Look, the past 3 decades, corn and the American people have had a bond that goes beyond just being best friends. It was the only thing that was there for them throughout so many nightmarish situations. Still, eggs, milk, butter, what was the idea here? Anyway, would you try this, or are you glad that this is one dish they left behind in the 60s?
Mushroom and leek salad is an old recipe that we can thank Europeans for. It's something that's always been really prominent in the many French, British, and Italian communities that are present in America. If you take a closer look at French culture, like a lot of Americans were doing during this point of the 20th century, you'll find that they've always played around with these 2 ingredients. The mushroom and leek salad in America doesn't exactly stick to any one kind of way of making the salad. It's got a little bit of everything, flavor, warmth, and a beautiful mixture of mushrooms that quenches what your heart craves. The French way is to emphasize the earthiness of the mushrooms, while the European way makes better use of the leek and dresses it up with vinegar and herbs. The Italian way sort of does both, and the American variant of the salad has regional differences depending on which area has more of which community.
In the 1960s, if you went for duck à l'orange, it would run you around 40 to 90 cents, and that would heavily depend on the level of sophistication you could expect from the place you were going to. The orange juice here really wasn't anything, almost a non-factor really. The sauce, therefore, was pretty expensive. It was something that adventurous and daring home cooks tried to incorporate into their home menus, but it was something that was best left to restaurants and French chefs who really knew how to do it well. That is, until Julia Child made these dishes super accessible with all of her work as a television star. Northeast California and Chicago were cities with all kinds of populations of French popular. Duck wasn't really the most popular ingredient, at least not like it is now. This dish was one of the few ones that really popularized the potential duck had as a high-class food, but it was still not what you would call gourmet food or fine dining. The rick and savoriness of the duck meat coupled with the crispiness of the duck skin was really something to behold, though. Plus, all the aromatics like shallots and garlic were to die for. It was something that you would see in fine dining places and restaurants in California, but those were few and far between, and they were handled by some very top-of-the-line chefs. Duck wasn't really an everyday meat. Of course, even if inflation didn't happen, since it's just more popular now, it would still be some decently pricey game. But around the 60s, it was something most middle-class families could afford to save up for if they tried. In times of scarcity, necessity breeds innovation. And in the case of peanut butter and mayo sandwiches, it also bred a surprising snack. This unconventional combo was a staple for those looking to get creative with limited ingredients. The affordability of peanut butter paired with the accessibility of mayonnaise created a budget-friendly sandwich that could be whipped up in minutes. Peanut butter provided protein, healthy fats, and a satisfying richness, while mayo added a creamy texture and a hint of tang. Sure, the combination may sound strange to some, but when you're in a pinch, sometimes the best ideas come from thinking outside the lunchbox. Add a slice of bread to the mix, and you had a meal that offered substance, energy, and a bit of unexpected flair. The nutritional value here wasn't stellar, but it did the trick. Peanut butter gave you a solid hit of protein and fat, while mayo brought extra calories to keep you going. A simple sandwich like this was a reminder of how people used what was available, no matter how unconventional. Despite its quirky flavor profile, the peanut butter and mayo sandwich was a testament to resourcefulness, and perhaps to a little bit of childhood adventure. So, like I was just telling you, Spam used to be the next big thing, and for good reason too. We had things like Spam and cheese roll-ups. A typical 70s office lunch would look like slices of Spam that had been rolled up with mustard and cheese. Now, these could either be grilled to enhance the smokiness of the Spam and make it contrast nicer with the pineapple, or you could bake it so that the cheese would melt and the mustard would mix in with it better for an overall more well-rounded flavor. All things considered, this was on the right track. It was quick, it was tasty, it was healthy, and it was also what people needed during a time where re-entering the workforce was really hard and put a lot of people out of their usual routines. The thing is, America is known for fickle trends. We'll like something one day, swear by it the next, and forget it halfway into the night. Spam and cheese roll-ups were good, but they took a sideline and started being party food more than a work lunch. Meat turnovers in the 1960s were a really common choice of snack during the 1960s, and this is actually something we entirely have fast food culture and industrialization to thank for. The 1960s was a time when companies were slowly realizing the sheer goldmine that is convenience food. Canned food was just the start, the gateway drug, if you would. The next step would be to go on over to frozen foods, which is exactly where you would find most of the stuff for a meat turnover anyway. The rise of frozen beef, pork, chicken, and sausages, all of it meant that you could now have ease of access to meat dishes like literally never before. The best fillings throughout most homes were things like beef stew fillings or lots of diced sausages, often drenched in a spicy gravy or cheese mix. Beef turnovers were some of the nicest ones to come out of it, really. You would wrap all these frozen meats into one flaky pastry, and that was that. There were all kinds of options for it too. You could get Stauffer's, Banquet, and Callender's, all of which even started pulling out their own frozen turnovers. It was a cash cow, one after the next, and no company was not taking advantage of it.
Louise's lasagna was this adaptable lasagna recipe that did a lot of substituting and took advantage of the trends of the decade. Remember how we talked about the way people were really opening up to zucchini, and also how farming mushrooms was easier than it ever was? While we aren't sure who the first Louise to do it was, we do know that there were loads of people who made amazing use of both of those facts, and this lasagna is just one more testament to that statement. It basically substitutes a lot of typical lasagna ingredients. Normally, most Americans use cottage cheese in their lasagna. This time around, the dish asks for ricotta. You normally don't really see many vegetables in lasagnas either, but this time around, zucchini and mushrooms make a wonderful appearance as the B team for this dish. As far as the meats go, that area is pretty much the same. Lots of places had their own versions of spice blends and sauces that they'd save for this recipe. But the idea was basically to reinvent lasagnas with the trends of the times.
Eggplant parmesans were these really cheap summer trends that would just be around 40 cents per pound, but were wonderful ways of having eggplants. In Italian-American communities, especially in places like New Jersey and Chicago, these were so common because eggplants had always been a thing there, and they only increased after the events of the first half of the 20th century. Eggplants were easy to grow in those backyard gardens people had during the Depression, and Italian-Americans lent whatever knowledge they had of how to cook one as much as they could. It meant that everyone's culinary horizons expanded for the better, really. The taste here was phenomenal. You had these crispy layers of breaded eggplant that had completely soaked up the tomato sauce and were enveloped in decadent melted cheese. The sides of pasta or ziti were wonderful, and the stuffing of garlic gave it the perfect kick it needed. All in all, this was a fantastic way of having an eggplant. Born out of wartime ingenuity and embraced by post-war kitchens, Spam was the ultimate culinary utility player. With its long shelf life, low cost, and endless versatility, it found its way into dishes of every kind, and pairing it with eggs became a breakfast staple for families on a budget. Introduced during World War II as a protein-packed ration, Spam was an affordable option for households that couldn't always afford fresh meat. A single can could be sliced, diced, or fried, transforming a little into a lot. When combined with eggs, another inexpensive and widely available food, you had a hearty, protein-filled meal that stuck to your ribs without sticking to your wallet. Nutritionally speaking, it wasn't a perfect meal. Spam's high sodium and fat content might make a dietitian cringe, but it delivered plenty of calories and protein, which were often all that mattered at the time. Add in the eggs, with their rich source of nutrients like vitamin D and iron, and you had a plate of energy to start the day. For those who grew up in the 1960s, the sizzle of Spam in a frying pan is as nostalgic as a black and white TV. Love it or hate it, this combination holds a unique cultural significance. Stuffed hot dog boats were something that were really popular among working-class families. This is because a lot of these meals so far are really practical and good for sustainable, everyday use, but they're a little lacking in the fun factor. Stuffed hot dog boats made up for this, though. They were kid-friendly, and they became something of a novelty meal with how much children ended up taking to them. They were also really popular in church cookbooks as a budget-friendly and creative dish. The idea behind a stuffed hot dog boat was that you would slice the dog right down the middle and then fill it with different kinds of toppings, kind of like a boat. These toppings would typically be baked beans, mashed potatoes, chili and cheese, or bacon bits. Anything on hand would work, really, and people would experiment and play around with different kinds of fillings. Either way, it was a dish that was just fun to make, especially with your kids. It was also the kind of thing that was genuinely filling because of the way it was built. You could end up consuming more than your daily protein needs just off of one or two of these. Pickle roll-ups, on the other hand, were a wonderful party-time snack that became the star of two types of gatherings: cocktail parties and potlucks. See, in potlucks, it was really common for people to bring one of everything and just have a lot to eat for the family, But cocktail parties were an entirely different kind of beast. The post-World War II era in America was a strange one. It saw lots of cultural shifts and new trends that people couldn't have ever guessed would make some serious headway into the mainstream. Despite that, these parties that were pretty much just wine-tasting parties but with cocktails turned into little competitive nights where people would compare their finger foods and the host would try their damnedest to pick a menu that suits everyone's tastes. By the end of it, no one would really even get drunk. What they would get, though, is pretty tipsy. And you must not be a stranger to the need for snacking that arises when the drinks start hitting. Casual gatherings that were cocktail parties also saw a lot of use for pickle roll-ups, and as far as snacks went, this was a pretty good option for hosts who couldn't spend a lot of time doing prep work.
Remember how I just talked about the way one-pan meals were becoming really common? Enter Moroccan salmon sheet pan dinner. This was really a sign of the times and showed just how much people were progressing towards food that was easier to make. It took a lot of inspiration from Moroccan cuisine. You know what? Maybe that was obvious. Anyway, it also fuses those traditional flavors with sheet pan cooking. You might be wondering how this is a regular everyday recipe for your family though. Well, now it isn't, thanks to all the sky-high prices if you go out looking for a good cut of salmon. Back then though, salmon actually used to be fairly popular, enough that it was one of the most regular seafoods you could get. This had all the highlights of salmon and Moroccan cuisine. The light and flavorful meat was only amplified to new levels by the incredible spice blends that Moroccan recipes are so well known for. The roasted vegetables made this into the whole package. You had a full plate of food that crossed every item on a nutritional checklist while still tasting and looking like $1,000,000.
Crepes Suzette is yet another example of how their ideas with cooking spread to all facets of our menus and culture. Flour, eggs, milk, and sugar are all ingredients any American home chef would be familiar with. And it's not like oranges were any new flavors for people. I mean, we've had citrus dishes for centuries. What was new to a lot of people in and out of restaurants was a French technique known as flambé. This was basically something that required a lot of patience, delicate skill, precision, and a lot of Grand Marnier, but the end result was worth it. Thanks to that little skill barrier, though, it became something that was not the go-to for a lot of home chefs, but something that thrived in French restaurants that prided themselves on bringing you the authentic flavors of France in the comfort of America. These thin and delicate crepes were drenched in a citrusy and butter-heavy sauce, and they were quite the trend. When times were tight, few sandwiches were as practical as one made with liver spread. An affordable pantry item, liver spread was a go-to for stretching meals without breaking the bank. Whether served on white bread or a slice of toast, this humble spread turned into a meal that was quick to prepare and didn't require much else. Liver spread was packed with protein, iron, and vitamin A, nutrients that many families needed, especially when fresh meat wasn't always on the menu. While it wasn't the most glamorous option, it was certainly filling. Many families would slather it generously on bread, sometimes adding pickles or mustard for a burst of flavor. It wasn't haute cuisine, but it got the job done. This dish carried with it a sense of nostalgia for many who grew up in the 1960s. It was a meal shared in kitchens across the country, from urban apartments to rural homes, a testament to the creativity that came from making do with limited resources. It may not have been the most celebrated sandwich, but it was one that spoke to the resourcefulness and resilience of families just trying to get by. Potatoes weren't the only option. They were great, but not the only ones. On days when people would naturally get too tired of eating potatoes, they would always go for things like baked bean sandwiches. This was a filling, no-fuss meal that was especially loved by working-class homes that were doing labor-intensive work. They were very common in the Northeast, the Midwest, and different parts of the South, especially where any kind of construction was going on. It was also really helpful that so many brands had come out with such accessible and easy canned beans. These were cheap, required no effort to cook, and the result was something you could use in a soup, a sandwich, or a casserole. It just depended on what you were feeling that day. Either way, you were going to get a delicious meal. One of the biggest reasons I think this was as popular as it was is because people really began to rely on it during the Great Depression. Another good reason is that this was the perfect lunch for your kids, and it was so low effort that making it wasn't a hassle at all. So, I talked a lot about how potlucks were basically this little nice family thing where people would get their picnic on and bring all kinds of dishes to the whole thing. It was a nice little event, you know? One of the traditions that came out of that was the potluck mystery dish. For this, basically, suspense was the name of the game. Each potluck would involve one specific person who would be in charge of bringing the mystery dish. So, usually there would be some kind of coordination or pre-planning. People would talk to each other. Dave would ask Jack if he was bringing the ribs, and Sarah would ask Caitlin if she was bringing the fried fish fingers, that sort of thing. Here, though, nobody had any clue. The best part? It was entirely up to the chef what the mystery dish would even be. Dishes were always prepared using pantry staples, and no one was bringing in something like a casserole, so you'd actually get all kinds of wild cards from this. Sometimes you'd get a Jell-O sandwich or a gingerbread stuffed with cheese or an entirely new kind of stew. Sometimes people would play into the unpredictability and bring in an old classic knowing that a simple answer wouldn't be what people were expecting. No matter what the case, it was pretty fun.
The concept of a dill mushroom turnover was pretty much taken from the trend of pastries with really sweet fillings. It's not really anything new, but it is one of those food traditions that disappears and resurfaces every other decade. You have counterparts for these in all cultures, but today we're talking about how dill mushroom turnovers became such a cultural moment in America. In Pennsylvania, which was pretty much widely known for its incredible mushroom farming potential, advancements in farming techniques meant that it was a golden age for mushroom lovers. Dills, on the other hand, were slowly becoming more and more popular thanks to all the European immigrants coming over. Then you had cocktail culture. A lot of people were going to cocktail parties that basically featured appetizers and one-bite dishes. There was a bigger focus on digestible, light food instead of hearty, grand, and massive plates that could feed a whole family. You take all three of those changes, and what do you get? Tortillas, and they're an amazing choice for an entree.
So the next list of items on the list is something that's pretty much firmly within the reach of an average middle-class budget. We're going to start off with chicken Kiev, which is essentially just these boneless and skinless chicken breasts. They weren't really so common in the 60s, but the idea here was that since whole chickens were decently cheaper, like around 30 cents a pound, home cooks would pretty much just debone them on their own. Nowadays, we're quite used to getting our meals deboned for us. Plus, eventually, frozen chicken Kiev that was pre-made became something that was available in supermarkets. This was part of the new wave of convenient gourmet options that basically meant high-class dishes that before were either something locked behind a skill barrier or financial incapability were now things everyone could enjoy. In the world of quick, budget-friendly meals, few combinations are as iconic as hot dogs and beans. This pairing was a go-to for families looking to fill hungry stomachs without breaking the bank. Hot dogs were cheap, accessible, and could be stretched into multiple meals, while canned beans were a pantry staple that required little more than a good heat-up. Together, they created a meal that was both filling and practical. Hot dogs may not have been the pinnacle of nutritional excellence, but they did offer a good dose of protein and calories to keep you going. Canned beans, while often high in sodium, provided fiber and a hint of vitamins. It wasn't exactly a superfood combination, but when you're trying to make the most of what you've got, it did the trick. This dish was often a weeknight go-to, perfect for busy families who needed something quick and affordable. Over the years, it became a cultural icon of frugality, eaten by kids after school, at picnics, or even at ball games. For many, it brings back fond memories of simple meals shared with family or friends. Potato and onion sandwiches are still something that I can see working today. They just feel a lot more closer to the realm of sanity than putting mayonnaise on bananas. Potatoes and onions together are a classic combination that has never failed anyone, and they weren't going to break that record in our country either. They became a hit in the Appalachian areas and the South, and there was an incredible need among the public for their regular fixing of potato and onion sandwiches. This was also one of the few meals you could have that would be entirely free. if you had the luxury of having your own land to grow plants and crops on, no matter how big or small, you definitely wanted to take advantage of potatoes and onions. They were very easy crops to grow, and having them meant a nice supply of food right out of your own home. If you didn't have room to grow anything, which is pretty understandable especially for office workers in big urban cities, you could always just buy one of these. It was so cheap it may as well have been free anyway. This is the decade of casseroles. It would be pretty disrespectful if we didn't talk about one of the most influential ones ever. Savory bread pudding was a casserole entirely made out of eggs, milk, cream, and bread. You might be thinking how something like this could ever be called a casserole, since it sounds like downright blasphemy, but hold your horses. It was a typical 1960s meal in lots of places, specifically rural ones. If you ever had a bad case of stale bread and leftover milk and cream, or if you just wanted a nice dessert with a comforting consistency, then you'd definitely go for this. Some savory bread puddings also included meats like ham, bacon, and sausages, though it was mostly just sausages since they were the most popular thing to add in this decade. The draw of this dish would be how it had a crispy exterior, but a very soft, almost porridge-like core that would make digging into it a delight for your senses. Some people would go the vegan route and add all kinds of vegetables like green onions and spinach. Even green peas were popular. You'd combine all of these and bake the bread, and the end result was something that grandmothers in particular loved making for their doting grandkids.
If you really go into the trenches of rustic, Southern cooking, you'll discover onion bowls. One thing about the wartime period was how much rationing was a thing throughout the country, and that basically meant that there was a void to fill. When the typical staple ingredients people were used to weren't available to them anymore, they had to make do with whatever was easy to grow. That meant a lot of potatoes and onions, but on their own, onions really didn't amount to all that. Onion boils, however, were a pretty nice and nifty little fix to that conundrum. These boils revolved around making your onions by placing them in a broth that had a lot of seasonings and sometimes other vegetables too. Home cooks thought it was a pretty inexpensive and frugal meal that helped stretch out your groceries just a bit more until the end of the month. A lot of people in the South also thought it made for a really good side dish too. I mean, after all, it is just onions in a broth with some seasonings. Home cooks would rely a lot on convenient food like this to pass the days, especially with more and more women taking up places in the workforce. This was a meal that even your kid could make for themselves easily.
One more thing that you would be a fool if you didn't include in your pantry was homemade bread rolls. See, the thing about those survival tricks that people picked up during the Depression was that old habits die pretty hard, especially when they save as much money as these were. Lots of people, even ones who had never even caught a whiff of an oven, began to at least learn how to make their own bread at home during the Depression thanks to how cost-effective it was. I mean, really, how could you compete with it? All you needed back then were leavening and shortening agents, some flour and yeast, and while that was still hard to get, it made people that much more skilled at making do with what they had. This meant that when things did settle down and people got access to actual good ingredients they could use for making homemade bread rolls, they were fantastic at it. Store-bought bread rolls like Parker House just couldn't compete. Plus, it added this touch of care and personalization when you would bake a bread roll for someone for Thanksgiving, you know? Milk and macaroni was the kind of dish you'd find on the dinner table when there wasn't much else to go around. It was minimalism at its best. Boiled elbow macaroni, warm milk, and maybe a pinch of salt or sugar for flavor. Some might even call it the ancestor of modern comfort food. The genius of this dish was its accessibility. Pasta was cheap, milk was a staple in most households, and together, they created something that felt like a meal without requiring much else. For a few extra pennies, you could jazz it up with a sprinkle of cheese, a pat of butter, or even a shake of pepper to add some flair. Nutritionally, it might not win any awards, but it did the job. The carbs from the macaroni provided energy, while the milk brought a modest amount of protein and calcium. It wasn't fancy, but it filled empty stomachs, a small victory during lean times. For many, milk and macaroni stirs up warm memories of childhood, sitting around the kitchen table and enjoying something made with care. It's a reminder that even when resources were scarce, meals didn't have to feel that way. With just 2 basic ingredients, families created a dish that left them feeling full and, in its own way, a little bit hopeful. The next best thing was definitely ham salad sandwiches. If you wanted a low-effort meal that would also make sure you were keeping muscle on, then there was arguably nothing better to go for than a ham salad sandwich. You might be thinking about the economics of all this because it does take a decent amount of ham to really make a salad. Not a lot, but hey, not a little bit either. So how does this really translate into it becoming an everyday staple for everyone? Well, the thing is that people would be frugal with the amount of ham they would put in there. They put enough bits to just make it a good sandwich, but not enough that the ham flavor would dominate the salad. Plus, this was a portable meal that you could have just about anywhere, which really made it stand out in terms of how convenient it was for people. Also, one of the best ways people would save costs on this meal was that they would use leftovers of ham and repurpose them into this salad. It was one of the best things to take along on family picnics, too. Mock chicken legs were a result of mock culture, which was pretty much another Depression-era special. The whole idea was to mimic the most popular foods that people used to make with what used to be their everyday staples in the pantries. That stuff wasn't becoming available anytime soon, so people decided to mimic those flavors and textures with what they had. Luckily, some of these stuck to the wall a lot better than others, mock chicken legs being one of them. They were kind of popular throughout the 1960s, not too much, but not so little that you could completely write them off. They were affordable, and hey, the vegans loved it. Besides that, people thought they could probably do with a little less meat in their diet anyway. Just look at this list. How many meat-heavy options could you spot? I mean, neither you nor I are doctors, but I think you'd agree with me that maybe we have a track record of overdoing it? This country is full of meatheads after all, and they caused a ruckus back then over this too. People were complaining about it being fake meat and having all kinds of nasty additives that would give you stage 3 colon cancer or something. It was really just textured vegetable protein though, and these were substitutes for meat that were specifically designed to appeal to a vegetarian crowd. Plus, they were stupidly cheap. It helped when you couldn't afford regular meat, even if you were a vegan.
If you really want to get ancient, exotic, and foreign, there's no better dish to talk about than mujadara. This thing is pretty much as much of a relic as the Old Testament itself. It was one of the most popular, and honestly, one of the first lentil-based dishes to dominate the globe. It used a lot of simple things like rice and caramelized onions, but it was hailed in really high regard for how healthy it was on a budget. That led to it being seen as poor man's food, even in the United States. But its reputation changed in the 60s as an exotic vintage dish that a lot of people wanted to get into. After having recently found a new, deep appreciation for lentils and simple rice-based dishes, Americans couldn't wait to try more and more of what the world had to offer in this regard. The spice blend is really worth talking about here, since the use of cumin, coriander, cinnamon, and allspice isn't exactly the most conventional blend in American settings. A lot of people have forgotten this dish, but when Middle Eastern cuisine was still making its mark, it was one of the most talked about dishes you could try out.
On the other hand, Bananas Foster was a dessert that was very, very cheap. Man, I can't even tell you how many kids would die for this. It would be a non-stop pity party of how nothing good ever happened to them and how they really, really want a Banana Foster. They'd do the dishes, they'd promise to do all the chores, get their homework done by 7, eat some broccoli, not go out, get in bed by 9, and just be the spitting image of a model child, all for a serving of Foster. Why was it so good? Well, you tell me what happens when you put butter, brown sugar, vanilla ice cream, and more cinnamon than is probably safe for a kid or anyone really in one place. Now, of course, Bananas Foster does involve rum, and when serving it to children, that was an aspect of the dish people chose to exclude. But when the dinner table was above 18, oh boy, both bananas and bottles of rum would finish, and that was something you could come to expect like clockwork. This was actually something that was made in Brennan's restaurant in New Orleans around 1951, but it didn't get as popular as it is in this description until later on into the 60s, especially in highly metropolitan areas. In the world of budget cooking, Few ingredients stretch as far or as creatively as cabbage. The cabbage hot dish, a hearty one-pan meal, was a 1960s favorite for feeding families without emptying wallets. It was the definition of frugality. Take a humble head of cabbage, some ground meat, a handful of rice or pasta, and let the oven work its magic. Cabbage was a star of affordability and accessibility. It was cheap, readily available year-round, and versatile enough to adapt to whatever you had on hand. Add in ground beef or pork when it fit the budget, and maybe a can of condensed soup or some tomato sauce, and you had a complete meal. Even leftovers were fair game, making this dish a true champion of resourcefulness. On the nutritional front, cabbage brought fiber, vitamin C, and potassium, while the meat and starch added protein and energy. It wasn't going to win over food critics, but it did the important job of keeping families full and nourished. For many, the cabbage hot dish evokes memories of church potlucks, family dinners, and that unmistakable aroma wafting from the oven. It's a dish rooted in practicality, but served with care. A reminder that even when times were tough, a warm, filling meal could still feel like home. Egg salad and olive sandwiches were also one of the best combinations people had when times were tough. Around the end of the month, when your pay would be finishing up and you were stretching the last of your groceries, it was very common for people to make this for breakfast. It was really easy to elevate a simple sandwich into something more delicious thanks to this combination, and it got very popular in church fundraiser cookbooks. You would also see this on school cafeteria menus, and it was a really popular choice for picnics and potlucks too. For a humble sandwich that's just egg salad and olives, it definitely got around. This sandwich worked amazingly well as a packable lunch you could take with you or as a quick little family meal. Eggs were still not too expensive for most people, so working-class families relied on them as much as they could. 1 or 2 eggs was enough for the dish if you were being modest, and if you had some sauces to throw on top, then that would be even better. We've taken a lot from our European neighbors over the years. Cabbage rolls were just another thing that we adopted from places far beyond American soil or shores. Once you try them, they're actually significantly better than most people give them credit for. Cabbage rolls used to be known by all kinds of names in different countries. It was typical to make it with a combination of beef and pork, and then mix in buckwheat or rice. People also put in fresh mushrooms or some fruits, and you might be thinking, okay, but where's the cabbage roll part? All of this was centered around the cabbage. You wouldn't get big, generous servings of all these sides. They were just there in the roll to make the cabbage better and to fill out the meal a bit more. Think of it like a taco, you know? The cabbage roll was a big part of the World War II era diet that most people had grown accustomed to. And that's maybe why some people nostalgically still ate this.
Spaghetti diable is pretty much a pasta dish that's known for not being forgiving. Some dishes tend to be approachable. You feel like they're inviting you to try them, and they look irresistible too. Not this diable, not in any way at all. It looks like your typical plate of pasta, although with a lot of warm colors, but it tastes like it's trying to hurt you. This spaghetti is known entirely for its devilish heat, which has sent more than a few people to the counter asking for a glass of milk. It's not really the chili that does it this time. It's the black pepper. This pasta dish is known entirely for how spicy it can get, but the American version is actually a lot tamer. If you were making the original, authentic Italian version of the dish, which some communities and restaurants did, you'd be tackling an entirely different beast. On top of the black pepper and chili, you also have red pepper flakes and cayenne pepper in the sauce. So yeah, don't try this if you wouldn't bet money on your spice tolerance. I know I'd lose that bet, so I steer a little clear from dishes like these. But spicy variations of typical dishes like spaghetti were actually getting more and more popular throughout the 60s.
Swedish meatballs were affordable, easy to make, and really just the perfect thing for entertaining a crowd. They became popular as a part of party culture, which was something that the 70s were known for, but it was something that had been bubbling well before that, in the 60s. Also, canned and powdered mixes of gravy were something that made the meatball preparation process infinitely easier. Ground beef here was also costing around 50 cents a pound, or at best 70, and pantry regulars like allspice and nutmeg or eggs were really common ingredients. Overall, it wasn't hard to make this dish, but it was hard to make it again and again. The demand for these meatballs was crazy. The simple truth is that Americans were bored of what they were eating. They had all the meatloafs and meatballs you could think of, and if they were going to have it again, they wanted it in a new and refreshing way. The answer to this dilemma was to take other cultures' ideas on meatballs, and that's how we got here. Cabbage and bacon fry-up was something people adored for its simplicity and its affordability. It was a hearty meal you would frequently see on dinner tables throughout the 1960s if you weren't already tired of seeing it everywhere in cookbooks. It was very common to see this in Appalachia and the South, because cabbage was especially cheap there. Bacon was something the entire nation had a deep-found appreciation for, but the South was always one step ahead in all things savory. The dish was supposed to be a main course meal with a side. This would usually be cornbread or potatoes, but if you were working with lower quantities, then this dish could also do great as a side dish. Cabbage was one of the most affordable vegetables on the entire market, and it was not seasonal. Back then, refrigeration had not become a countrywide phenomena that everyone could rely on 24/7 like we do. We have our fridges on all the time, you know? And cabbage was one of those kinds of vegetables that could last for weeks and weeks without any kind of refrigeration. It was really quick and easy, it was flexible, and you could even try all kinds of different spices and toppings like ranch dressing to make it even better. I can't begin to tell you what a novelty canned meatloaf was. You take the darling sweetheart of every American's diet and put it in a can, make it easy to carry around, and sell it for like $1 or $2. You're sitting on a perpetual cash generator machine, and, well, lots of those CEOs are pretty well off now. Don't you wish you were born just a few decades ago when all these ideas hadn't happened and you could get rich off of them? Me too. Anyway, canned meatloafs were the next step in convenience food culture, and honestly, one of the things that made it such a prominent shift in the landscape of American eating. The cultural makeover that was happening, thanks to canned equivalents of everything Americans typically ate, meant that more and more people were deciding to spend their grocery money on canned food. Was this always good for you? Kind of. I mean, if even your home cooking is dominated by the idea of convenience and so is your takeout, then it's no wonder that lots of people thought the 1960s was where Americans really started getting a bit lazy and too focused on the 9-to-5 lifestyle. Still, canned meatloaf wasn't even bad. It was actually just as good as the real stuff, which was a surprise at that price point.
Poppy seed chicken was a byproduct of all the madness around casseroles that dominated so much of the 1960s. After the Second World War, there was such a big increase in the production and popularity of canned food. People couldn't deny the sheer value it had, and a lot of canned food meant that casseroles were easier than ever to make. The 1960s saw lots of creamy casserole recipes being raised to new heights. They were in the mainstream conversation, and they were at the dead center of it too. Casseroles would often use cream canned soups, like cream of chicken or cream of mushroom, for the base. These soups were really cheap, light, and easy to incorporate into lots of dishes. Poppy seeds, on the other hand, didn't really have much of a presence outside basic dishes like muffins and cakes, but they started to be used in savory dishes around this decade. It was a way to make your casserole look and taste just a bit better. For the chicken, you'd use boneless breasts, which was kind of another piece of evidence of how Americans were gravitating towards hassle-free food. The seeds would be mixed into the sauce, or you would use them as a garnish on top of the casserole, along with panko breadcrumbs. Some people in the South would really just use Ritz crackers, though. It was one of the best ways to satisfy that casserole itch, especially if you wanted a casserole that wasn't too new, but wasn't really familiar either.
Cheese balls with crackers were some of the most affordable things you could buy as a middle-class family in the 1960s. They were pretty much just for 50 to 55 cents, and Triscuits and Ritz were some brands that no household could really live without. These were pretty much the dominant cracker brands in the country, and this was a dish that was enjoyed essentially all throughout the nation. Especially in places like California and New York, where TV culture was fast approaching and people were more and more inclined towards easy-to-handle, prepare, and eat dishes like this. Plus, Who could contest how good of a comfort food this was? It was super convenient on all fronts. It had cheese and it had a crunchy kick thanks to the crackers. It was a dish that was born out of the worst times of the Great Depression, and it was something that particularly shined in Rust Belt cities. It was incredibly popular among immigrant communities. So, there wasn't any actual chicken in this, but using grounded pork or even veal hoe chefs would shape the meat into the form of a drumstick. Pork was significantly cheaper than chicken, especially drumsticks, and since this was made out of round meat and relied on being shaped, even less desirable cuts could work for it. Some even used mixes of veal and pork, and others even went as far as to make their own vegetarian-based versions using mushrooms, mashed potatoes, and other vegetables. They were served alongside similar vegetables to make sure the dish was as hearty as it could be, and it was actually pretty okay for the time. It's not something that you would ever pick over an actual drumstick or something that people think really mimics the flavor too well, but for something that was made out of the most bare-bones ingredients, it was actually pretty okay. Even school children would be eating this, and church and funeral gatherings were often known to serve these as well whenever they could. One of the best things people did is that they also repurposed stale breading with this dish by using it for breadcrumbs. They would fry those in lard, and it would actually be pretty okay DIY fast food. Which cheap 1960s recipe would you bring back to stretch your grocery budget today? Share your favorite memory in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more thrifty recipes from the golden age of home cooking.